Consciousness and the unconscious. They form opposite ends of the psyche. But a profound transformation can occur when these two poles are actually united. Jung called this process the transcendent function, and it is both a method of treating neuroses, as well as being a mechanism through which a person can reach their highest potential. In this video, I will take you through Jung's paper on the transcendent function, in order to understand the effects and benefits of uniting consciousness with the unconscious. Consciousness, which includes both our awareness and our egos, has special characteristics which make human culture and civilization possible. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind, writes Jung, are extremely important acquisitions, which humanity has bought at a very heavy sacrifice, and which in turn have rendered humanity the highest service. Without them, science, technology, and civilization would be impossible, for they all presuppose the reliable continuity and directedness of the conscious process. The advantage of consciousness is that it enables us to act purposefully, since we can filter the contents of our minds and focus on what we consider to be important. This naturally implies that the scope of consciousness is narrow, like a flashlight which can only illuminate one thing at a time. This narrow scope means that consciousness must exclude certain contents, such as external events which aren't worth noting, or contents of the mind which are deliberately repressed by the ego, such as embarrassing memories. The ego in this sense acts like a filter, and it is this property which allows it to concentrate on a limited number of things at any given time. Another characteristic of consciousness is that it is self-referential. By this, I mean that the ego judges and discriminates based on what it already knows and what it's familiar with, and has a tendency to exclude things which are incompatible with its preconceptions. As Jung puts it, this judgment is partial and prejudiced, since it chooses one particular possibility at the cost of all the others. The judgment in its turn is always based on experience, i.e. on what is already known. As a rule, it is never based on what is new, what is still unknown, and what under certain conditions might considerably enrich the directed process. Consciousness is primarily a re-representation of things which have been learned, and so it is greatly conditioned by cultural factors. The things you learn as a child and are taught to you by your society usually become re-represented by the conscious ego, to the exclusion of other possibilities which lie beyond the narrow view of the ego. The things you were taught in school, for instance, become the basis of your consciousness and your understanding, which effectively locks people into a particular way of viewing the world. This rigidness of the ego explains why some people can't be convinced of anything which challenges their previous beliefs, or why they latch onto ideas which seemingly confirm their preconceived notions. In other words, it explains confirmation bias. As we grow up and adapt to society, we more or less accept the things which we are told, and so our consciousness takes on the character of our culture. We are shaped by others to an immense degree, so much so that the words we use and the way we think often reflects the society in which we live. Our egos are a product of culture, and formed largely from the influence of other people. The strict disposition of consciousness naturally rejects perspectives which don't agree with the preformed view of the ego, and prejudices us into preferring what is logical and rational. But our standards of logic are based upon what we learn through our culture, and so may only appear to be so. The very rationality of the judgment may even be the worst prejudice, since we call reasonable what appears reasonable to us. What appears to us unreasonable is therefore doomed to be excluded because of its irrational character. It may really be irrational, but may equally well merely appear irrational, without actually being so when seen from another standpoint. While this is useful in the modern world, which requires us to be focused on a limited number of ideas, it often causes a person to disregard new insights, which can transform their lives in a positive way. Since the ego is largely a product of culture, there is always the possibility that your conscious ego does not reflect who you are, but rather who society has conditioned you to be. The question can then be asked, how can we widen the scope of consciousness? Or to put it another way, how can we transcend consciousness? This can be achieved through the unconscious, which differs significantly from the conscious mind in terms of how it approaches the world. The tendencies of the conscious and the unconscious are the two factors that together make up the transcendent function. It is called transcendent because it makes the transition from one attitude to another organically possible, without loss of the unconscious. It is through the transcendent function that we can go beyond the confines of our consciousness and widen its scope, enabling the ego to incorporate more information. While the conscious mind is focused and directed, the unconscious mind is more chaotic and random. But while consciousness can only re-represent ideas that a person is already familiar with, it is the unconscious mind which is able to take a fresh perspective, and doesn't rely on ideas which were learned previously. The unconscious is able to loosen the constraints of the conscious ego, making it possible for the mind to receive new information, even if it contradicts what a person previously believed. This enables an expansion of the ego, and the possibility of widening our horizons. As Jung writes, consciousness is continually widened through the confrontation with previously unconscious contents, or to be more accurate, could be widened if it took the trouble to integrate them. But how exactly does this transcendent function work? Normally, the contents of the unconscious mind are not detectable because they are unconscious. But when the ego loosens, which Jung calls an abaissement du niveau, these contents can be experienced as images, which are quite different from consciously directed thoughts. Such is the case with dream images. Since the dream originates in sleep, it bears all the characteristics of an abaissement du niveau mental, or of low energy tension, logical discontinuity, fragmentary character, analogy formations, superficial associations of the verbal, clang, or visual type, condensations, irrational expressions, confusion, etc. Notice how a dream is usually a chaotic series of images with little coherency. This is the language of the unconscious mind. It isn't linear and explicit like the conscious mind, but random and fantastical. The unconscious also speaks to us in the form of intuition, feelings rather than discursive thoughts. These strange forms, which emanate from the unconscious, at first seem irrelevant to our everyday lives, but Jung believed that when treated properly, they can be constructive and point us along paths which our ego is ignorant of. The chaotic nature of dreams is in stark contrast to the conscious mind, and so its images can almost seem alien, but at the same time they open us up to a world of possibilities beyond our everyday experience. Furthermore, the unconscious also appears to us while we are awake in the form of imaginations, such as when we daydream. The same applies to the subsequent images and ideas which frequently occur while dozing or rise up spontaneously on waking. Although these contents seem rather chaotic, it is precisely this chaos which enables us to break the shackles of the ego. Dreams have the potential to reveal thoughts which we don't otherwise experience consciously, things which our conscious ego is likely to disregard. Jung believed that the goal of a psychotherapist was to use a patient's dreams to help see what his unconscious was saying. Remember that dreams come from your psyche, and so often reveal things about you, but do so in a way that is different from consciousness. While consciousness is linear and explicit, the unconscious needs to be interpreted, similar to interpreting the deeper meaning in a work of art. One prejudice which prevents us from working with our dreams is the modern prejudice that reality takes precedent to fantasy, but fantasy, which is how the unconscious makes its presence known, is the realm of creativity. Whenever we want to think outside the box, outside the realms of the familiar, it is the unconscious which enables us to do this. In fact, Jung makes a note about the fact that great artists are in tune with their unconscious minds. We may say in general that social worthlessness increases to the degree that these qualities, consciousness, are impaired by the unconscious. Great artists, and others distinguished by creative gifts, are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The very advantage that such individuals enjoy consists precisely in the permeability of the partition separating the conscious and the unconscious. The unconscious supplements the conscious mind to bring a change in attitude. It allows us to take a deeper perspective on things, which we don't normally consider, and thereby enrich the conscious conceptions we already possess. This is how we can attain a sense of individuality, since it allows us to shake up the ego, which has been conditioned by society. This modification of the ego allows us to take our own perspectives, apart from what is believed by the collective, and integrate the portions of our personalities which differ from others. Thus, the transcendent function is a key component in the process of individuation. While consciousness has an excluding function, the unconscious has a connecting function, allowing us to see connections between related ideas. One way to understand this is to realize that consciousness has an obsessive need to put things into categories, but the unconscious, being more flexible in its thinking, dissolves the distinctive boundaries which the conscious mind tends to put up. It is this ability to connect which gives the unconscious immense powers in our ability to think. Many of the greatest discoveries in science were not found through the discursive method of consciousness, but by allowing ideas to connect naturally in the unconscious, leading to a transcendence. This transcendence occurs when we allow the conscious mind to relax, so that our unconscious mind can find connections between different ideas that we have in our mind. Einstein's greatest ideas were said to come to him spontaneously, with no conscious effort whatsoever. As the unconscious finds these connections, it presents them to the conscious mind, so that we can experience a greater range of consciousness. This process allows us to modify our egos, since the ego will be better able to represent who a person is internally, rather than just who society shapes them to be. The ego is also frequently stubborn when it comes to integrating new insights, especially when they contradict old information that we've absorbed. However, momentarily dissolving the ego puts one in a receptive state, and so the transcendent function can cause a true transformation of the personality. In essence, the unconscious can be thought of as a different person, whose personality and attitude differs sharply from the ego, but should still be consulted, since his perspective may be valuable. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings with equal rights, each of whom gives the other credit for a valid argument, and considers it worthwhile to modify the conflicting standpoints by means of thorough comparison and discussion, or else to distinguish them clearly from one another. Although analyzing dreams is one way to access and integrate the unconscious, it is rather difficult due to the fleeting nature of dreams. In recent years, more approachable methods have become common, such as inducing altered states of consciousness. These states of mind, which can be induced through various techniques, allow one to explore their unconscious, and so experience the transcendent function more directly. And by such methods, one can experience firsthand how the unconscious operates as a connector rather than a separator, synthesizing new ideas and insights. It is arguable that using altered states of consciousness is a more effective method of studying the unconscious than dream analysis, and so as these methods become more mainstream, Jung's insights in the past will become increasingly helpful as we navigate the unknown portions of the human mind.